The Arizona desert was like a giant oven that day, the kind of heat that makes you feel like your skin is cooking right on your bones. Jack Morrison had been riding for nearly 6 hours straight, and both he and his horse were exhausted. Dusty, his loyal mare, had been with him for almost 8 years now. She knew the desert trails better than most humans, and Jack trusted her with his life. Jack was a cowboy, but not the kind you see in fancy pictures. His clothes were faded and patched in several places. His hat had holes from years under the brutal sun. He was 53 years old, which was considered pretty old for someone living the hard life of the frontier. His face was weathered like old leather, with deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the endless sunlight. He was carrying important papers to Fort Apache. Messages about supply routes and potential trouble spots. It was dangerous work, but it paid enough to keep him going. The year was 1882, and the tensions between settlers and the Apache people were still high. Every ride through this territory carried risk. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a small sip from his canteen. Water was precious out here, and he had to make it last. Dusty's ears suddenly perked up, and she slowed her pace without Jack even pulling the reins. The horse had sensed something. After all these years together, Jack had learned to trust Dusty's instincts more than his own sometimes. He scanned the horizon carefully. Nothing but rocks, scattered brush, and endless sand. Then he saw it. Near a cluster of large boulders, there was something that didn't belong, a dark shape against the reddish rocks. At first, Jack thought it might be an animal, maybe a dead coyote or deer. But as Dusty cautiously moved closer, his heart sank. It was a person, a woman lying motionless on the ground. Jack's first instinct was caution. Out here, you never knew what situation you were walking into. It could be a trap. He'd heard stories of ambushes, of people using injured folks as bait. His hand moved to his rifle just in case. But as he got closer, he realized this was no trap. The woman was young, probably in her early 20s. She was Apache. That much was clear from her clothing and the way her long black hair was arranged. But what struck Jack most was the wound on her leg. It was bad. Really bad. The kind of injury that kills you slowly if you don't get help fast. Her leg was swollen to almost twice its normal size. The skin around a deep gash was an angry red color, with streaks running up toward her knee. Infection. Jack had seen enough wounds in his life to know this one was serious. The woman's breathing was shallow, and her skin felt hot to the touch when he carefully checked for a pulse. She was still alive, but barely. Jack sat back on his heels and looked around. There was no one else in sight. No camp, no other people, nothing. How had she ended up here alone? Had she been in a fight? Was she running from something? These questions didn't really matter right now. What mattered was that she was dying, and he was the only person who could help. Now this was a complicated situation. Jack had lived through years of conflict between settlers and Apache tribes. He'd lost friends in raids. He'd seen terrible things done by both sides. Most cowboys wouldn't even consider helping an Apache woman. Some would have just ridden past. Others might have done worse. But Jack had never been like most people. His mother had raised him to believe that all people deserved basic human decency, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She used to say, "Jack, when you meet someone in need, you don't ask their name or their history first. You help first, ask questions later." He pulled out his canteen and carefully lifted the woman's head. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were dark and filled with pain and fear. Jack spoke softly, even though he wasn't sure she could understand English. "Easy now. I'm here to help. You're going to be okay." He dribbled a little water into her mouth. She swallowed weakly, and her lips moved as if trying to say something. The sound that came out was barely a whisper. "Nalta," she said. Her name was Nalti. Jack examined her leg more closely. The wound looked several days old. It was probably from an animal attack or maybe a fall onto sharp rocks. Whatever had caused it, the lack of treatment had let the infection take hold. Her body was fighting a battle it was losing. He tried to make her comfortable, using his jacket to cushion her head against the hard ground. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Beautiful, but also a reminder that darkness was coming, and in the desert, night could be as dangerous as day. Jack faced a terrible problem. Nalti needed medicine and proper care immediately. The nearest place to get that was either Fort Apache, which was still 2 days' ride away, or an Apache settlement somewhere in the mountains to the east. He wasn't even sure exactly where the Apache camps were. The tribes moved frequently and for good reason. They were being pushed off their ancestral lands, forced to keep relocating. He could try to take her to Fort Apache, but that meant riding with her on Dusty. In her weakened state, with that infection, he wasn't sure she'd survive the journey. The bouncing and jostling of riding could make things worse. Plus, there was no guarantee the fort would even treat her. Some soldiers might, but others would refuse to help an Apache woman. The other option was to try to get her back to her own people. They would know how to treat her. Apache medicine was different from what settlers used, but Jack had heard it could be effective. The problem was he didn't know where to find them, and traveling while searching could waste precious time she didn't have. Jack sat there in the fading light, next to this dying woman whose name he'd just learned, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Whatever choice he made in the next few minutes would determine whether Nalte lived or died. And maybe, though he didn't know it yet, it would also determine the course of his own life for years to come. Dusty nudged his shoulder with her nose, as if asking what they were going to do. Jack looked at his faithful horse, then back at Nalte's pale, fevered face. An idea was forming in his mind. It was crazy, maybe even suicidal for him, but it might be the only chance this young woman had. He stood up and made his decision. There was no going back now. Jack knew what he had to do, but knowing it and actually doing it were two very different things. He looked down at Nalte, then over at Dusty, his horse, his companion, his only real means of survival in this harsh land, and he was about to send her away. The plan forming in Jack's mind was simple but terrifying. Nalte needed to get to help fast, faster than he could take her. But Dusty was smart, really smart. Horses have incredible instincts for finding their way home, and they can also sense water and settlements from miles away. If Jack pointed Dusty in the right direction toward the mountains where Apache camps were likely located, the horse might find them. It was a long shot, but it was Nalte's best chance. The problem was, if he sent Dusty away with Nalte, he'd be stuck in the middle of the desert with no transportation. Fort Apache was at least 40 miles away. On foot in this heat with limited water, that journey could easily kill him. He'd be gambling his own life on the chance that Nalte might survive. Jack had bought Dusty 8 years ago from a ranch in New Mexico. She'd been young then, barely broken in. He'd trained her himself, spent countless hours teaching her to respond to his commands, to stay calm during storms and rattlesnake encounters. They'd crossed rivers together, weathered blizzards, outrun trouble more than once. A cowboy's horse wasn't just transportation, it was a partner. Losing Dusty would be like losing a piece of himself. And beyond the emotional attachment, there was the practical reality. Without a horse in this territory, Jack would be vulnerable, slow, an easy target for the elements or anyone meaning harm. He thought about just making Nalte as comfortable as possible and riding for help himself. He could bring back a doctor or medicine, but looking at her fevered face and that angry, infected wound, he knew she didn't have the time. She'd be dead before he got back. Jack knelt down beside Nalte again. Her breathing had become more labored. Time was running out. He pulled out his knife and cut strips from his spare shirt. He needed to secure her to Dusty somehow, create a way for her to stay on the horse even if she lost consciousness completely. Working carefully, Jack fashioned a kind of harness using his rope and the cloth strips. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep Nalte from falling off. He then did something that took all his strength. He lifted her up. She was light, probably didn't weigh more than 110 pounds. But moving her without causing more pain to that leg was difficult. Dusty stood absolutely still, as if she understood the seriousness of the situation. Jack had always believed horses were smarter than people gave them credit for. He positioned Nalte across the saddle, tying her securely but not so tight that it would hurt her. She moaned softly but didn't wake up. Jack grabbed his canteen and tied it where Nalte could reach it if she regained consciousness. He also left her his jacket, knowing the desert nights got cold. Then came the hardest part. He had to let go. Standing there in the dimming light, Jack put his hand on Dusty's neck. The horse turned her head to look at him with those big, gentle eyes. "I know this is strange, girl," Jack said quietly, "but I need you to do something for me. I need you to take her to help. Go toward those mountains. Find people. You can do this." He pointed toward the eastern mountains where the last rays of sunlight were catching the peaks. Somewhere up there, Apache camps existed. Somewhere up there, Nalty might find people who could save her. Jack gave Dusty a gentle push. The horse hesitated, looking back at him. She was confused. In all their years together, Jack had never sent her away like this. But he pushed again, more firmly this time. "Go on, Dusty, go." The horse finally started walking, slowly at first, then picking up to a steady pace. Jack watched them disappear into the gathering darkness. His heart felt like it was being pulled out of his chest. That horse had been his constant companion through so many hard times, and now she was gone. The desert suddenly felt very big and very empty. Jack took stock of what he had left. His rifle, a nearly empty canteen with maybe 2 cups of water, a small pouch with some dried meat and hardtack, a box of matches. His knife, that was it. That was all he had to get himself 40 miles across hostile territory to Fort Apache. He looked up at the sky. Stars were starting to appear, bright and cold. Jack knew he couldn't travel at night in unfamiliar territory. Too easy to get turned around, step on a snake, or walk off a cliff in the dark. He'd have to wait for morning. He found a spot between 2 large rocks that would give him some shelter and sat down. The temperature was already dropping. Desert nights could be brutally cold, and without his jacket, Jack was going to be uncomfortable. But discomfort was better than death, and if his sacrifice meant Nalty lived, it would be worth it. As he sat there in the darkness, Jack wondered if he'd made the right choice. Was he a fool for risking everything for a stranger? An Apache woman, no less, when tensions between their peoples were so high. His friends at Fort Apache would probably think he'd lost his mind. Some might even call him a traitor for helping the enemy. But Jack had never seen people as enemies just because of who they were born as. He'd seen too much of what hate did to people. It twisted them, made them cruel, turned them into something less than human. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "The minute you stop seeing people as people, Jack, that's the minute you lose your own humanity." He took a tiny sip of water, knowing he had to ration it carefully. The night stretched out ahead of him, long and uncertain. Tomorrow he'd start walking. 40 miles, in boots that were already falling apart, with almost no water, under a sun that showed no mercy. Jack pulled his hat down over his eyes and leaned back against the rock. Sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept drifting to Nalty. Was she still alive? Had Dusty found help, or had he sent them both to their deaths? And if he died out here in the desert, who would even know? Who would care? Jack had no family left. His parents were long gone. He'd never married, never had children. He'd lived a solitary life, moving from ranch to ranch, job to job, always staying on the edges of things. Maybe that's why this decision had been easier for him than it would have been for someone else. He didn't have much to lose. No wife waiting for him, no kids depending on him. Just his own life, and honestly, he wasn't sure how much that was worth anymore. But as he sat there in the cold desert night, Jack realized something. Maybe his life hadn't amounted to much up until now, but if saving Nalty was the last thing he ever did, that would be something. That would mean he'd left the world a little better than he found it, and wasn't that all anyone could really hope for? The stars wheeled slowly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Jack closed his eyes and tried to rest. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the hardest journey of his life, and he had no idea if he'd survive it. Jack woke up before sunrise, his body stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard ground. The cold had seeped into his bones, and for a moment he didn't want to move. But he knew he had to get going. The morning hours were the coolest part of the day, and he needed to cover as much distance as possible before the sun reached its peak. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting. At 53, his body didn't bounce back from rough nights like it used to. He brushed the dust off his pants and took a careful sip from his canteen. The water was warm and stale, but it was life. Looking toward the east, Jack tried to orient himself. Fort Apache was southwest from here. He knew the general direction, but without proper landmarks, it was easy to get turned around in the desert. Everything looked the same after a while. Red rocks, sandy patches, scrub brush. One hill looked like every other hill. He started walking. The first hour wasn't too bad. The air was cool and his body settled into a rhythm. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. He'd walked long distances before. Cowboys did a lot of walking when they weren't riding, but this was different. This wasn't walking back to a ranch after checking fences. This was walking for survival. By the time the sun rose fully above the horizon, Jack had covered maybe 3 miles. Not bad, but he had 37 more to go. He tried not to think about that number. It was too overwhelming. Instead, he focused on smaller goals. Get to that distant rock formation. Make it to that dried riverbed. Just keep moving. The heat began to build. By mid-morning, it was already becoming uncomfortable. Jack's shirt was soaked with sweat. He wanted desperately to drink more water, but he forced himself to take only tiny sips. His canteen was getting lighter. He figured he had maybe enough for today if he was very careful. After that, he'd have to find water somehow or he'd die of dehydration. His boots were a problem. The leather had cracked in several places from years of hard use. With each step, he could feel small rocks and sand getting inside. His feet were starting to hurt and he knew blisters were forming. But there was nothing to do except keep walking. Around noon, Jack had to stop. The heat was simply too intense to continue. He found a large boulder that cast a shadow and collapsed in its shade. His head was pounding and his vision was starting to blur slightly around the edges. These were warning signs: dehydration, heat exhaustion. If he pushed too hard, he'd collapse and never get up. He allowed himself 2 small sips of water and ate a piece of the dried meat from his pouch. It was tough and salty, which made him even thirstier, but he needed the energy. While he rested, his mind wandered back to Nalty and Dusty. Were they okay? Had they found help? He imagined Dusty finding an Apache camp, the people there discovering Nalty tied to the saddle, pulling her down and working to save her life. He hoped that's what had happened. The alternative, that they were both dead somewhere in the wilderness, was too painful to think about. After about 2 hours, when the sun had moved enough that the heat was slightly less intense, Jack forced himself to stand up. His legs had stiffened during the rest, and for a terrifying moment he wasn't sure they'd support his weight. But he steadied himself and started walking again. The afternoon was brutal. The heat seemed to press down on him from above and radiate up from the ground below. He was being cooked from both directions. His canteen was nearly empty now. Maybe enough for 2 more small sips. His tongue felt thick in his mouth and his lips were cracked and bleeding. Jack's mind started playing tricks on him. He kept seeing water in the distance, beautiful, sparkling pools of it, but every time he got closer, they disappeared. Mirages, the desert's cruel joke. He knew they weren't real, but that didn't stop his desperate brain from hoping each time. By late afternoon, he'd finished his water. The canteen was completely empty. Jack knew this was very bad. Without water in this heat, he had maybe 24 hours before his body started shutting down, less if he kept pushing himself this hard. But what choice did he have? He couldn't just sit down and wait to die, so he kept walking, 1 foot in front of the other. His vision was definitely getting worse now. Everything seemed fuzzy, like he was looking through dirty glass. His thoughts were becoming jumbled too. He'd start thinking about one thing, then forget what it was mid-thought. That first night was terrible. Jack found a place to rest, but without water and with his body so overheated he couldn't really sleep. He just lay there in the darkness, shivering despite the lingering warmth, his mind drifting in and out of strange dreams. When the sun rose on the second day, Jack barely had the strength to stand. But somehow he did. He started walking again, though his pace was much slower now. He stumbled frequently, his feet not quite obeying his brain's commands. The second day blurred together into a nightmare of heat and thirst. Jack's lips were so cracked they'd started bleeding worse. His tongue was swollen. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. He'd stopped sweating, which was a very bad sign. It meant his body didn't have enough water left to produce sweat. He kept walking, though he wasn't entirely sure why anymore. Some deep survival instinct kept his legs moving even when his conscious mind wanted to give up. The sun beat down mercilessly. Hours passed, though Jack had lost track of time. Was it morning? Afternoon? He couldn't tell anymore. At some point during the second day, Jack's legs finally gave out. He collapsed near a dried creek bed, his body simply refusing to go any further. He lay there, face down in the sand, knowing this was probably it. This was where his story ended. In the middle of nowhere alone, his body becoming food for desert scavengers. He thought about his mother. She died when he was 25, over 28 years ago now. He wondered if he'd see her again, if there was anything after this life. He hoped there was. He hoped she'd be proud of what he'd done, even if it had cost him everything. Jack's eyes closed. Opening them again felt like too much work. He could feel consciousness slipping away. Maybe that was for the best. At least when he was unconscious, he wouldn't feel the terrible thirst anymore. But then, something made him open his eyes one more time. A sound, or maybe a vibration in the ground. He couldn't tell if it was real or just his dying brain making things up. But there was definitely something. Movement, coming closer. With tremendous effort, Jack lifted his head slightly. His vision was so blurred he could barely see anything. But there were shapes in the distance. Dark shapes, moving toward him. Several of them riders, people on horses. Coming this way? Jack tried to call out, but his swollen tongue wouldn't work properly. Only a weak croak came out. He tried to wave his arm, but it barely moved. The shapes got closer. He still couldn't tell if they were real or just another cruel hallucination. His head dropped back to the ground. He'd done all he could. Whether those riders were real or not, whether they'd help him or hurt him, it didn't matter anymore. Jack had reached his limit. Darkness closed in around him and he stopped fighting it. Everything went black. When Jack's eyes finally opened, he had no idea where he was or how much time had passed. Above him was some kind of curved ceiling made from branches and hide. Soft light filtered through gaps in the structure. His mouth felt less like sandpaper, and when he swallowed, it didn't hurt quite as much as before. He tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it. His head spun and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. A gentle hand pressed him back down. Jack turned his head slowly and found himself looking at an elderly man with long gray hair and deep wrinkles that spoke of a life lived under the sun. The man said something in a language Jack didn't understand. Apache, he realized. He was in an Apache camp. The memories came flooding back. Nalte, the wounded woman, sending Dusty away. His desperate walk through the desert, collapsing. The elderly man brought a bowl to Jack's lips. Water. Cool, blessed water. Jack wanted to gulp it all down, but the man controlled the flow, giving him only small sips. Smart. Too much water too fast after severe dehydration could be dangerous. After Jack had drunk enough, the old man set the bowl aside and began checking him over. He looked at Jack's cracked lips, examined his sunburned skin, and carefully removed Jack's boots to inspect his feet. The blisters were bad. The old man made a disapproving clicking sound with his tongue and began applying some kind of paste to them. It stung at first, then felt cool and soothing. Jack's mind was clearing slowly. He was alive. These Apache people had found him and brought him to their camp. They were taking care of him, but why? After years of conflict between their peoples, why would they help a cowboy? Over the next few hours, other people came to check on Jack. Warriors, mostly men with strong, weathered faces and watchful eyes. They didn't seem hostile, but they definitely weren't friendly either. They looked at him the way you might look at a dangerous animal, something that needed to be watched carefully. Later that day, a younger man entered who spoke broken Spanish mixed with a few English words. Jack knew enough Spanish to communicate. Through this interpreter, whose name was Chayton, Jack learned what had happened. Dusty had indeed found the Apache camp 3 days ago now. When the people saw an obviously non-Apache horse approaching with a wounded woman tied to its saddle, they'd been shocked. They'd taken Nalte down and recognized her immediately. She was well known among several Apache bands. Her father had been a respected warrior who died fighting to protect their land. Nalte had drifted in and out of consciousness, but during her lucid moments she'd told them about Jack, about how he'd found her dying in the desert, about how he'd given up his only horse, his only means of survival, to try to save her life, about how he'd sent her off on Dusty and then started walking alone across the deadly desert. The story had caused quite a stir in the camp. Some people didn't believe it. Cowboys didn't help Apache women. Cowboys were the enemy. Surely this was some kind of trick. Maybe the cowboy had been trying to kidnap her and she'd escaped. Maybe he was part of a larger group planning an attack. But Nalte, even in her fever, had been insistent. The cowboy had saved her. He'd sacrificed everything for a stranger. A chief named Cochino had listened to her story and made a decision. If what she said was true, if this cowboy had truly shown such extraordinary courage and selflessness, then honor demanded they try to find him. Warriors had ridden out in the direction Nalte had come from. They'd followed Dusty's trail backward, knowing that somewhere along that path they'd either find Jack or find his body. After 2 days of searching, They'd found him collapsed near a dried creek bed, barely alive. Now, Chayton explained, there was a debate happening in the camp. What should they do with Jack? Nalta's life debt was clear. Jack had saved her, so they'd saved him. That was fair. Some people argued they should simply nurse him back to health and then escort him out of their territory, release him and be done with it. But others were suspicious. Who was this cowboy really? What was he doing out in the desert alone? Could he be a scout for the army, looking for Apache camps to report? Even if he'd helped Nalte, that didn't mean he was trustworthy. As the days passed and Jack grew stronger, he became more aware of the camp around him. It wasn't large, maybe 40 or 50 people. There were wiki-ups like the one he was in, arranged in a loose circle. Children played in the center area, their laughter sounding just like children anywhere. Women worked on various tasks, preparing food, making clothes, treating animal hides. The men often gathered in groups, talking in low voices. Jack noticed they frequently glanced in his direction. He understood their suspicion. If the situation were reversed, if an Apache man showed up in a cowboy camp, he'd probably be shot on sight. These people were showing him far more mercy than his own kind likely would have shown them. On the 5th day, Nalte came to see him. She walked with a slight limp, but she was alive and clearly recovering well. Her leg had been treated with Apache medicine, herbs and poultices that Jack didn't recognize but which had apparently worked. The infection was gone, and the wound was healing cleanly. She sat down near Jack's sleeping area and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then, through Chayton, who translated, she said, "You gave me your horse. You have no horse. You walked in desert with no water. You nearly died. Why?" Jack thought about how to answer. Finally, he said simply, "Because you needed help and I could give it. That's all." Nalte shook her head slightly. "White men do not help Apache. Apache do not help white men. This is how things are. But you are different." "Why?" Jack met her gaze. "My mother taught me that when you see someone suffering, you don't ask who they are first. You help first. I saw you dying and I couldn't just leave you there." Nalte translated this for the others who had gathered to listen. There was murmuring among them. Some seemed moved by his words. Others remained skeptical. That evening, Chief Cochino came to speak with Jack. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. Through Chayton, he asked Jack many questions. Where was he from? What was he doing in the desert? Did he work for the army? Did he know where other Apache camps were located? Jack answered honestly. He explained he was just a cowboy carrying messages, that he had no connection to the army beyond occasionally delivering their mail. He didn't know where any other Apache camps were. He'd spent his life avoiding conflicts, not seeking them out. Cochino listened carefully to everything Jack said. Finally, he spoke at length. Chayton translated, "Nalte speaks highly of you. She says you sacrificed much to save her life. This is not something we see often from your people. You could have left her to die. Many would have." "Some would have done worse," Jack nodded but said nothing. Cochino continued, "A life debt is sacred among our people. Nalte owes you her life, but also we owe you her life. She is daughter of great warrior. She is valued member of our people. By saving her, you have done great service to us." Jack felt uncomfortable with this praise. He hadn't done it expecting thanks. He'd just done what felt right, but Cochino wasn't finished. "However," he said, and his tone became more serious, "we must decide what to do with you now. Some of my people say we should release you, send you back to your fort with food and water. Others say we cannot trust you. They say even though you helped Nalte, you might tell soldiers where to find us." Jack's heart sank. He understood their dilemma. He'd seen their camp location. Even though he had no intention of telling anyone, how could they be sure of that? Cochino looked at Jack steadily. "Nalte has made a proposal. She wishes to speak with you about it tomorrow. Listen to what she has to say. Then we will make final decision about your future." With that, the chief left. Jack lay back on his blankets, wondering what proposal Nalte could possibly have in mind. Whatever it was, his life seemed to depend on it. Tomorrow would determine whether he'd leave this camp alive or never leave at all. Jack barely slept that night. His mind kept racing, trying to imagine what Nalte's proposal might be. Would she ask him to stay permanently? To work for the tribe somehow? Or was this some kind of test he had to pass? By the time morning light began filtering through the wiki-up, he'd imagined 100 different scenarios. Nalti arrived mid-morning, accompanied by Chaitin and one of the elder women. She looked much healthier now. Her color had returned, and though she still favored her injured leg slightly, she moved with confidence and grace. She sat down across from Jack, and for a long moment she just studied his face. Finally, she began to speak, with Chaitin translating carefully. "In our tradition," she said, "when someone saves another person's life, especially in the way you saved mine, a debt is created. This is not a small thing. This is sacred. The life debt must be repaid in a way that equals the sacrifice made." Jack nodded, listening intently. "There are traditionally 3 ways to repay such a debt," Nalti continued. "The first is to save the person's life in return. If you were dying, I would be obligated to sacrifice everything to save you as you did for me. But you are not dying now. You are healing, so this way is not available to me at this moment." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "The second way is to create a bond of kinship, to make you part of our family, our tribe, to give you a place among us permanently. Some have suggested this, but I do not think this is what you want. You have your own life, your own path, and I do not think you wish to leave that behind completely." Jack felt relief that she understood this. He respected these people, but he wasn't Apache. He couldn't just become something he wasn't. "The third way," Nalti said, and now her voice became quieter, more serious, "is to share one's greatest treasure, to give something of such value that it equals the gift of life itself." Jack waited, his heart beating faster. Where was this going? Nalti looked directly into his eyes. "My father was a warrior, a leader. He fought in many battles to protect our land, our people. When I was young, maybe 12 summers old, he took me on a journey into the mountains. He showed me something that his father had shown him, and his father's father had shown his father, a secret passed down through generations of our family." She paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. Finally, she did. "There is a canyon, hidden, very difficult to find if you do not know the way. In this canyon, there is a cave. And in this cave, there are things left behind by the Spanish, the ones who came before long ago looking for gold and glory." Jack's breath caught. Everyone who'd spent time in the Southwest had heard legends about Spanish treasure, conquistadors who'd supposedly hidden gold in various places before being killed or driven off. Most people thought these were just stories, myths told around campfires. "You are saying there is Spanish gold?" Jack asked carefully. Nalta nodded slowly. "My great-grandfather found it when he was young. He told my grandfather, who told my father, who told me. We have kept it secret because we knew that if others learned of it, they would come. They would tear apart our land looking for it. They would push us away, take everything. So we have guarded this secret generation after generation." She looked down at her hands. "When my father died 2 winters ago, I became the only person alive who knows the exact location. I have told no one, not even Chief Cochino. This is my greatest treasure, not the gold itself, but the knowledge of where it is. The trust my father placed in me." Jack was stunned. This was the last thing he'd expected to hear. Nalta continued. "I have thought much about this since you saved my life. About what I could give you that would equal your sacrifice. I have few possessions. I am not wealthy in the way your people measure wealth. But I have this knowledge, and I believe this is what I must share with you." Before Jack could respond, she held up her hand. "But I have conditions. This cannot be simple. If I tell you where the gold is and you go and take it, you could betray us. You could bring others. You could tell the army or other whites, and they would come and tear apart our sacred places looking for more treasure." Jack understood her dilemma. She wanted to repay her debt, but she also had to protect her people. "So this is my proposal," Nalte said, her voice becoming firmer, more formal. "I will share this secret with you. I will take you to this canyon and show you where the Spanish left their gold. You may take what you can carry, but there are 3 conditions you must accept." Jack leaned forward. "What conditions?" "First," Nalte said, holding up one finger, "you must live among us for 1 full season. 3 moons. In this time you will learn our ways. You will work alongside us. You will show us your true character. If at any time during these 3 moons you prove untrustworthy, or if you try to leave before the time is complete, the agreement is void. You will be escorted from our territory with nothing." That seemed fair, Jack thought. They wanted to make sure he was worthy of this trust. Second, Nalte continued, raising a second finger, when we do find the gold, and when you take your share, you must promise never to tell anyone where it came from. Never lead others to this place. Never speak of how you came to possess it. The location must remain secret even after you leave us. Jack nodded. I can promise that. Third, and now Nalte's voice became very serious, you must promise that some of what you take will be used to help our people. Not directly to this band, which might raise suspicion, but to Apache people in general. Those who suffer on reservations. Those who need medicine, food, supplies. You must become a secret friend to our people, using your white face to help where we cannot help ourselves. This third condition surprised Jack, but it also moved him deeply. She wasn't just thinking of repaying her debt. She was thinking of how to turn his good deed into something that would help her people for years to come. These are my conditions, Nalte said. If you accept them, I will honor my life debt by sharing my greatest treasure with you. If you do not accept or if you break any of these promises, I will consider my debt unpaid, and you will be released from our camp with nothing but your life and supplies to reach your destination. The elder woman who'd been sitting silently spoke now for the first time. Chayton translated, This is an unprecedented offer. Never has one of our people shared such knowledge with an outsider. Nalte does this because she believes your deed was unprecedented. But know this, Cowboy, we will be watching. If you betray this trust, there will be consequences. Jack sat back, his mind reeling. 3 months living with the Apache, learning their ways, proving himself, and at the end, potentially enough gold to change his life forever, but also a huge responsibility. A promise to use that wealth to help people who desperately needed it. He thought about what his life had been before all this. Drifting from job to job, no real purpose, no family, just existing day after day, with no particular goal beyond survival. This offer was a chance for something more. A chance to actually matter, to make a difference, but it was also dangerous. Living among people who had every reason to distrust him. One wrong move, one perceived betrayal, and he might not leave this camp alive. Jack looked at Nalte, at her steady, unwavering gaze. She'd been willing to trust him with her life when she was unconscious and helpless. Now she was offering to trust him with her people's greatest secret. How could he refuse? I accept your conditions, Jack said firmly. All 3 of them. I give you my word. Nalte nodded slowly and something like relief crossed her face. Then we have an agreement. You will stay with us for 3 moons. You will learn and work and prove yourself. And when the time is right, I will take you to the hidden canyon. She stood up to leave, then paused. My father used to say that the greatest treasures are not gold or silver, but the bonds between people who trust each other. You trusted me enough to risk your life. Now I am trusting you with something my family has protected for generations. Do not make me regret this trust, Jack Morrison. I won't, Jack promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As Nalte left the wiki-up, Jack realized his life had just changed completely. 3 months ago, he'd been just another aging cowboy, going through the motions of existence. Now he was about to embark on something extraordinary. Something that would either make him a wealthy man or get him killed. Maybe both. Outside, he could hear the sounds of camp life continuing. Children laughing, people talking. The normal rhythms of daily living. His daily living now, too. For the next 3 months, this was his world. He just hoped he'd live up to the trust Nalte had placed in him, because if he didn't, he had a feeling he'd never leave these mountains alive. The first week was the hardest. Jack was still recovering his strength, but the Apache didn't believe in letting people sit idle. As soon as he could walk without stumbling, they put him to work. Light work at first. Gathering firewood. Carrying water from the stream. Simple tasks that even the children did. But for Jack, weak from his ordeal in the desert, even these simple chores left him exhausted. The people watched him constantly. Not in an obvious way, but he felt their eyes on him always. Testing him. Judging him. Waiting for him to do something that would prove their suspicions right. That he was like all the other white men. That he couldn't be trusted. Jack understood this. He'd have done the same in their position. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried to learn as much as he could just by watching. The language was the first big challenge. Apache sounded completely different from any language Jack had ever heard. The sounds, the rhythms, the way words connected. It was like trying to learn music when you'd been tone deaf your whole life. But he tried. He listened carefully when people spoke. He pointed at objects and asked Chayton what they were called. He repeated words over and over, butchering the pronunciation until someone would take pity on him and correct it. The children found his attempts hilarious. They'd gather around when he was practicing words, giggling at his mistakes. At first, Jack found this embarrassing, but then he realized the children's laughter wasn't mean. They were just amused by this strange white man who couldn't even say simple words properly, and their attention gave him a chance to practice without the pressure of making mistakes in front of the warriors or elders. One little boy, maybe 7 years old, became something of a teacher to Jack. His name was Kel, which Chayton said meant sparrow. Kaylee would bring Jack objects and make him name them. When Jack got it right, Kaylee would clap. When he got it wrong, the boy would patiently repeat the correct pronunciation until Jack could manage it. Through Keel and the other children, Jack slowly began to pick up basic words and phrases, greetings, simple requests, words for food, water, fire, sky, earth. It was like building a house one small stone at a time, slow but steady progress. By the second week, Jack was feeling much stronger. His feet had healed, and his body had adapted to the constant physical activity. The work became harder. He helped the men with hunting preparations, learning to make arrows and repair weapons. He worked alongside the women sometimes too, which initially made some of the warriors uncomfortable. But Nalte explained to them that Jack needed to learn all aspects of Apache life, not just the parts considered men's work. The hunting lessons were humbling. Jack had thought he knew how to track and hunt. He'd been doing it for years, but compared to the Apache hunters, he realized he'd been stumbling around like a blind child. These people could read the earth like he read words on a page. An older hunter named Yaji took Jack under his wing. Not out of kindness, Jack suspected, but because Nalte had probably asked him to. Yaji didn't speak any English or Spanish, so they communicated through gestures and demonstrations. He'd point at marks in the dirt that Jack couldn't even see, let alone interpret. But gradually, through Yazi's patient teaching, Jack began to understand. A bent blade of grass meant an animal had passed recently. The depth and shape of a track told you not just what animal it was, but how fast it had been moving, whether it was injured, how long ago it had passed. The Apache hunters could follow a trail that was days old, reading the story of the animal's journey in signs that seemed invisible to Jack's untrained eyes. One day, about 3 weeks into his stay, Yazi took Jack on an actual hunt. Just the two of them. They left before dawn and moved silently through the hills. Jack tried his best to move quietly, to step where Yazi stepped, to watch what Yazi watched. After several hours, Yazi suddenly froze. He pointed to a spot ahead where, after several seconds of staring, Jack finally saw it. A deer, almost perfectly camouflaged among the rocks and brush. Yazi gestured for Jack to take the shot. Jack raised his rifle, but Yazi shook his head and pointed to the bow he'd given Jack to carry. The message was clear. If you're going to hunt with us, hunt our way. Jack had used a bow before, but not often. He knocked the arrow, drew back the string, aimed, and released. The arrow flew wide, startling the deer, which bounded away in seconds. Jack felt like a complete failure. But when he looked at Yazi, expecting disappointment or anger, he saw something else. The older man was smiling, not mocking, but approving. Later, through Chayton, Jack learned why. Yazi had said, he tried our way. He failed, but he tried. This shows respect. This shows willingness to learn. The deer escaped today, but the cowboy learned more than he would have if he'd shot it with his rifle. That night, Yazi shared his evening meal with Jack. It was the first time one of the warriors had voluntarily included him in something social. Jack felt like he'd passed some kind of test he hadn't even known he was taking. As the weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, Jack found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The constant physical activity had made him stronger and leaner than he'd been in years. His skin had darkened from the sun. His hands, always rough, had developed new calluses in different places from the different kinds of work he was doing. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the mental ones. Jack was learning to see the world differently. The Apache didn't view nature as something to conquer or exploit. They saw themselves as part of it. Every plant had a purpose. Every animal had a role. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was without meaning. He learned about plants he'd walked past his entire life without noticing. This one could treat wounds. That one could reduce fever. This other one, if prepared correctly, could help with pain. The old women of the camp were like walking libraries of botanical knowledge, and they began to teach Jack bits and pieces of what they knew. Nalta spent time with him regularly, though always with others present. She taught him about Apache history, about the different bands and their relationships with each other. She explained their spiritual beliefs, though Jack understood she was only sharing surface knowledge. The deeper, more sacred things weren't for outsiders, even trusted ones. She also told him stories about her father, about how he'd been a wise leader who'd always counseled caution rather than rash action, how he'd worked to keep his people safe during increasingly difficult times, how he'd died defending a group of women and children from soldiers who'd attacked them without warning. Jack listened to these stories and felt a deep sadness for what these people had endured: the broken treaties, the forced relocations, the constant pressure from settlers and soldiers who wanted them gone or dead. He'd been aware of these things in an abstract way before, but living among them, hearing their personal stories, made it real in a way it had never been. Around the 2-month mark, Jack realized something surprising. He didn't want to leave. Not yet, maybe not ever. He'd found something here that he'd been missing his entire life without knowing it. Purpose, community, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. The people had slowly begun to accept him too. Not completely. There was still wariness, still distance. But they no longer watched him like he might steal something or hurt someone. They included him in more activities, asked his opinion sometimes, though always through translation, treated him less like a dangerous outsider and more like a strange but harmless guest. One evening, sitting by the fire with a group of men, Jack tried to express something that had been on his mind. Through Chayton, he said, "I want to thank you all for letting me stay here, for teaching me. I know I was an unwelcome stranger, and I know many of you didn't trust me. Maybe some still don't, but you've shown me a kindness I don't deserve, and I won't forget it." The men listened to Chayton's translation. Then one of them, a warrior named Delson, who'd always been among the most suspicious of Jack, spoke. Chayton translated, "You speak of kindness, but what you did for Nalti was also kindness. Maybe we are even now. Maybe kindness creates more kindness. Maybe this is how peace could happen if more people on both sides were willing." It was the most profound thing Jack had heard during his entire stay. Maybe this is how peace could happen. Not through treaties signed by important men who'd never met each other, but through simple acts of human kindness between individuals, one person at a time, one act of trust at a time. As the 3rd month drew to a close, Nalte came to Jack one morning. "Tomorrow," she said through Chayton, "we will go to the hidden canyon. You have fulfilled your part of our agreement. You have stayed 3 moons. You have learned our ways. You have proven yourself trustworthy. Now I will fulfill my part." Jack felt a strange mix of emotions. Excitement about finally seeing this legendary treasure, but also sadness that this chapter of his life was ending, because he knew that once he had the gold, once he left this camp, things would never be the same. That night, lying in the wickiup that had become his home, Jack thought about how much he'd changed. 3 months ago, he'd been a lonely cowboy with no real connections to anyone or anything. Now he felt like he understood what it meant to be part of a community, to belong, to matter. Tomorrow he'd become a rich man. They left before sunrise, just Jack and Nalte. She'd told him to bring only essentials: water, some food, his knife, rope. They'd be gone for several days, she said. The journey was difficult and they needed to travel light. Chief Cochino had blessed their journey the night before, performing a ceremony that Jack didn't fully understand but respected deeply. As they walked away from camp, Jack noticed Dusty in the makeshift corral where the horses were kept. His faithful mare had been well cared for during his stay. She'd even put on some weight, looking healthier than she had in years. Dusty saw him and whinnied softly, as if asking where he'd been all this time. Jack went over and stroked her neck, promising silently that they'd be together again soon. Nalte led the way on foot, moving with confidence even though her legs still bore a slight limp from her injury. They headed east initially, toward the mountains Jack had seen in the distance so many times during his stay. The terrain was rough, all uphill, and within an hour Jack was breathing hard. Nalte, younger and accustomed to this landscape, moved steadily without seeming winded at all. They didn't talk much during that first day. Nalte was focused on the path, occasionally stopping to check landmarks that only she could recognize. Jack followed, conserving his energy for the climb. By the time the sun was directly overhead, they'd climbed high enough that the camp was no longer visible below them. They stopped for a brief rest in some water. Looking out over the vast desert landscape spread below, Jack was struck by its harsh beauty. From up here, you could see for miles in every direction. Red rocks, sandy plains, distant mountains creating a layered horizon. "My father brought me here when I was 12, Nalte said, speaking more to herself than to Jack. "I was so scared. The climb seemed impossible. My legs hurt, I cried, but he told me that anything worth having requires difficulty, that the treasure isn't just what you find at the end, but what you become by making the journey." Jack nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. They continued climbing through the afternoon. The path, if you could call it that, was barely visible. Nalte led them through narrow passages between rocks, along ledges that made Jack's stomach clench, across steep slopes where one wrong step could send you tumbling hundreds of feet down. Jack realized that without a guide, he'd never find this place in 1,000 years. The path was deliberately hidden, impossible to follow unless you knew exactly where you were going. As evening approached, they made camp in a small cave that provided shelter from the wind. Nalte gathered dry brush for a fire while Jack unpacked their meager supplies. They ate dried meat and some kind of flat bread that one of the campwomen had prepared for their journey. "Tomorrow will be harder," Nalte said, as they sat by the fire. "The last part of the journey is the most difficult, but also the most important. The Spanish who came here, they were clever. They knew others would look for their treasure, so they hid it in a place that seems impossible to reach." "How did your great-grandfather find it?" Jack asked. Nalte smiled slightly. "He was hunting a bighorn sheep. He followed it into places no one normally goes. The sheep disappeared into what looked like solid rock, but it wasn't. There was an opening hidden by the way the rocks aligned, only visible from certain angles. He followed the sheep through and found the cave on the other side." "And the sheep?" Jack asked. "He let it go," Nalte said. "He believed the animal was a spirit guide, showing him something important. To kill it after it had led him to such a discovery would have been wrong." They slept in the cave that night, taking turns keeping the fire going. The temperature dropped significantly after dark, and Jack was grateful for the warmth. He woke several times during the night, each time finding Nalte sitting by the fire staring into the flames with an expression he couldn't quite read. The second day was indeed harder. They climbed for hours, sometimes using their hands as much as their feet to pull themselves up steep sections. Jack's muscles burned with effort. His hands were scraped and bleeding from grabbing rough rock. But he pushed on, determined not to show weakness in front of Nalte. Around midday, they reached a section where the mountain face appeared to be sheer and unclimbable. Jack looked at it with growing concern. Surely they weren't expected to scale that. But Nalte walked along the base of the cliff, counting steps under her breath, until she stopped at a spot that looked identical to every other spot. "Here," she said. She pressed her body against the rock and began sliding sideways, disappearing into what Jack had thought was just a shadow. He followed and realized there was a narrow crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. They moved sideways through this passage for what felt like an eternity, the stone pressing in from both sides, making Jack fight against the panic of being trapped. Then suddenly, they emerged into open space. Jack blinked in the bright light and gasped at what he saw. They were in a hidden canyon, completely enclosed by sheer cliff walls. A small stream ran through it, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down from somewhere high above. Plants grew here, green and lush, protected from the harsh desert by the canyon walls. It was like a secret garden hidden in the middle of nowhere. "Few people have ever seen this place," Nalte said softly. "Maybe 20 in all of history. It is sacred to my family. And now you are here." They followed the stream deeper into the canyon. The walls rose higher around them, creating shadows even in the middle of the day. Birds nested in cracks in the rock, their calls echoing strangely. Jack felt like he'd stepped into another world, a place untouched by time. At the far end of the canyon, where the walls came together in a V shape, there was another waterfall, smaller than the first. Nalte led Jack behind it. The water created a curtain that hid a cave entrance just as she'd described. They ducked through the falling water, getting soaked in the process, and entered the cave. Inside it was cool and dark. Nalte pulled out a torch she'd prepared and lit it with flint and steel. The flickering light revealed a chamber about 20 feet across, and there, scattered across the floor and piled against the walls, was evidence of the Spanish presence. Old tools, rusted and ancient. Broken pottery, the remains of what might have been a wagon or cart, its wood mostly rotted away, and in the back corner, partially hidden under fallen rocks, several leather pouches and a few small wooden boxes. Jack's heart raced as they approached. This was real. The legend was actually true. Nalte knelt down and began carefully moving rocks aside. Some of the pouches had rotted and torn, their contents spilled on the cave floor. Gold coins, tarnished black with age but still gold. Spanish colonial pieces, Jack realized, probably hundreds of years old. The wooden boxes were in better condition. Nalte opened one, and inside were small gold bars, each about the size of a deck of cards. 6 of them in that box. She opened another box and found the same, and another. "There is more than I remembered," Nalte said quietly. "Or perhaps I was too young when my father showed me, and I didn't understand how much was here." They spent the next hour carefully examining everything. Jack counted approximately 200 coins in various denominations, plus 18 small gold bars. There were also some silver pieces, though heavily tarnished. The total value would be substantial. Not enough to make someone a king, but certainly enough to change a life. As Jack handled these artifacts from another era, he thought about the Spanish conquistadors who'd brought them here. Had they intended to return? Had they died somewhere in these mountains? Had they been killed by Apache warriors defending their land? The gold was silent on its history, keeping its secrets. "You can take half," Nalte said. "Half of the coins and 9 of the bars. The rest I will leave here for my family's future. Perhaps someday my children, or their children, will need it." Jack began selecting coins, trying to choose a mix that would be easiest to transport and eventually exchange. The bars were more problematic. Each one probably weighed close to a pound, so 9 bars meant 9 pounds of gold just there. Plus the coins. He'd be carrying maybe 15 to 20 pounds of gold total. Heavy, but manageable. They used Jack's spare shirt to create a pouch for the coins, tying it securely. The bars went into his pack, wrapped carefully in cloth so they wouldn't clank together. When everything was secured, Jack took one last look around the cave. "You're sure about this?" he asked Nalte. "Once I leave with this gold, you can't take it back." Nalte looked at him steadily. "I am sure. You saved my life. You kept your promises. You lived among us with respect and humility. You earned this. But remember your 3rd promise. Some of this gold must help my people." "I'll keep that promise," Jack said. "I'll use it to buy medicine, food, supplies. I'll find ways to get them to the reservations. I won't forget." They left the cave and made their way back through the hidden canyon. Jack carried the weight of the gold in his pack, but also the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just wealth. It was a trust, a promise, a bond between him and these people who'd shown him such extraordinary grace. The journey back to camp took 2 days, just as the journey out had. When they finally arrived, exhausted and dusty, Chief Cochino was waiting. He looked at Jack's heavy pack and nodded slowly. "You have completed your journey," he said through Chaitin. "You came to us as a stranger." Jack didn't go straight to Fort Apache. Instead, he headed south toward the New Mexico border, avoiding settlements and towns where people might ask too many questions about an aging cowboy suddenly carrying valuable goods. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to turn this gold into the life he'd promised Nalte he would build. After 2 weeks of careful travel, he reached a small town called Silver City. It was big enough to have a bank and assay office, but small enough that one more stranger wouldn't attract too much attention. Jack sold 3 of the gold bars through the assay office, claiming he'd found them while prospecting. The assayer looked skeptical but didn't ask too many questions. Gold was gold, and in New Mexico territory in 1882, people minded their own business. The money from those 3 bars was more than Jack had earned in the previous 5 years combined. It was strange holding that much cash in his hands. He put most of it in the bank under a false name, keeping only what he needed for immediate expenses. Then he began his real work. His first purchase was information. Jack spent time in saloons, listening to conversations, buying drinks for traders and merchants who did business on the reservations. He learned which reservation agents were honest and which were corrupt. He learned which traders would actually deliver goods to the Apache and which would pocket the money and deliver nothing. He learned the routes, the contacts, the methods. Then Jack began his anonymous campaign. He would approach certain traders privately, paying them well to purchase specific supplies: medicine, blankets, food. But with one condition: they could never reveal who'd hired them. If they ever spoke his name or described him, the arrangement would end immediately. Most of the traders agreed. Jack paid well, always in cash, and he wasn't asking them to do anything illegal, just to deliver goods to people who needed them. Over the next few months, shipments began arriving at various Apache reservations. No one knew where they came from. The reservation agents assumed the government had finally approved additional funding. The Apache assumed some sympathetic official had found a way to help them. Only a few people knew the truth, and they were sworn to secrecy. Jack kept meticulous records in a journal, written in a code only he understood. Every penny spent, every delivery arranged, every life potentially saved. It became his purpose, his mission. He wasn't just keeping a promise to Nalte. He was discovering that helping others gave his life a meaning it had never had before. With some of the remaining gold, Jack bought a small ranch near the New Mexico border. Not too grand, not too humble, just a decent piece of land with a good spring, some pasture for livestock, and a sturdy house that needed work. He named it the Hidden Canyon Ranch, a private joke that no one else would understand. The ranch became more than just a home. Jack made it known quietly and carefully that his place was safe for anyone who needed help. Apache passing through the territory could stop there for water and food, no questions asked. Settlers who'd been robbed or were in trouble could find temporary shelter. Jack asked only one thing: that people respect each other while they were there. No violence, no hate. His land was neutral ground. This didn't make him popular with everyone. Some of his white neighbors thought he was a fool or worse, a traitor. How could he help the savages? Didn't he know there was a war going on? But Jack didn't care what they thought. He'd seen a different side of things. He'd lived with the so-called enemy and found them to be just people. Struggling, suffering, trying to survive like everyone else. Nalte visited twice during the first year. She never announced her arrival, just appeared one day at sunset riding a paint horse, looking as confident and capable as ever. They would talk for hours, sitting on Jack's porch, watching the desert stars appear one by one. She told him about the camp, about how things were changing, how the pressure from settlers was increasing. More and more, we are pushed onto smaller lands, she said during her second visit. Soon there will be nowhere left to go. We will have to choose between reservations or war, and war would be suicide now. There are too many of you and too few of us. Jack listened, feeling the weight of history being made. These were the final days of a way of life that had existed for thousands of years. I wish I could do more, he said. Nalte shook her head. You do more than you know. The supplies that arrive at the reservations, the medicine, the food, these things save lives, not just bodies but spirits. They give people hope that someone somewhere cares whether they live or die. Over the years, Jack sold more of the gold, carefully and slowly, never enough to attract attention. He expanded his network of traders and suppliers. He learned which reservation doctors were sympathetic and which were not. He found ways to route money to schools being started for Apache children, though these schools were still few and controversial. The work was never-ending. Every dollar he spent revealed 10 more needs that weren't being met. It would have been overwhelming except that Jack had learned something during his time in the Apache camp. You can't save everyone. You can't fix everything. But you can do something. And something is always better than nothing. Nalte's visits became less frequent as the years passed. The Apache bands were being consolidated, forced onto reservations, their movements restricted. It became harder and harder for her to travel freely. But she sent messages through trusted intermediaries, letting Jack know she was alive, that she was well, that she remembered their bond. In 1886, when Geronimo surrendered and the Apache Wars officially ended, Jack felt a deep sadness. He knew what this meant. The Apache people would now be completely under government control. Their freedom gone, their traditional way of life essentially over. But he also knew that survival sometimes meant surrender, and living, even in difficult circumstances, was better than dying for a lost cause. He doubled his efforts after that. If the Apache couldn't live free on their land, he'd at least ensure they had what they needed to survive on the reservations. Medicine became his priority. Diseases spread quickly in the crowded reservation conditions. Tuberculosis, influenza, measles. Illnesses the Apache had little resistance to were killing people at alarming rates. Jack used his connections to route money to sympathetic doctors. He paid for medicine to be delivered, for medical supplies, for anything that might save lives. He never kept careful count of how much he spent. The gold was meant to help people, and that's exactly what he was doing with it. The ranch prospered modestly. Jack ran some cattle, employed a few workers, lived simply. People in the area knew him as a fair man, a bit strange perhaps, with his insistence on helping Indians, but honest and reliable. He never married. When people asked why, he'd just say he was married to the land, which was true in its own way. In 1895, 13 years after he'd first met Nalte, she came to visit one final time. She was 37 now, Jack calculated, though she still carried herself with the same grace he remembered. But there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The weight of years lived under oppression, of watching her people struggle and suffer. They sat on the porch as they always had, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I am married now," Nalte told him, "to a good man. We have 2 children, a boy and a girl." Jack smiled genuinely. "I'm happy for you." "Are they well?" "They are healthy," Nalte said, "but they are growing up in a world so different from the one I knew. They speak English better than Apache. They go to the white man's school. They are being taught that our old ways were wrong, that we must become like you to survive." The pain in her voice was obvious. Jack didn't know what to say. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't give her people their freedom back. All he could do was what he'd been doing. Small acts of help in an overwhelming sea of need. "The gold is almost gone," Jack admitted. "I've spent most of it over the years. On medicine, supplies, school funding, all the things we talked about." Nalte nodded slowly. "Good, this is what it was meant for. My father used to say that wealth hoarded is wealth wasted. Wealth used to help others is wealth multiplied. You have multiplied it well." She reached into a bag she'd brought and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought you something," she said, handing it to him. Jack unwrapped it carefully and found himself looking at a beautifully crafted knife in a decorated leather sheath. The handle was wrapped in intricate beadwork, and the blade, though clearly old, had been maintained perfectly. "This was my father's," Nalte said. "He carried it in the battle where he died. I want you to have it. Not as payment, because our debt was settled long ago, but as a gift, from one friend to another, so that you remember, so that you know how much what you've done has meant." Jack felt tears forming, which embarrassed him. He was 66 years old, too old to cry, but he couldn't help it. "I'll treasure this," he managed to say. "Always." They talked late into the night, reminiscing about that strange time when a cowboy had lived among the Apache, about the people from the camp, many of whom had passed away or been scattered to different reservations, about Kile, the little boy who'd taught Jack Apache words. He was a young man now, Nalte said, trying to keep the old traditions alive while adapting to the new reality. When Nalte left the next morning, Jack had a feeling he'd never see her again.